The other day I booted up an old game that I had, which is Brainlord. This game is an old school game that, even only because of its name, you can already tell that this game didn't give a fuck. It's a very weird ass name, Brainlord. And this game was made by Enix. Later, that company fused with Squaresoft and made up Square Enix. And playing through Brainlord made me realize why old school gaming was better than modern gaming. In my opinion, old school gaming is the PS2 era and before. Everything that came around the PS2 and before is old school gaming, and the PS3, the Xbox 360 and forward is when everything went downhill. Now, this is not me saying that PS3 games or Xbox 360 games all are terrible. It's not the case, but that was pretty much when I personally detect the heavy decline of gaming around that era. Now, many of you are going to argue and you're going to say, what about this game? What about this particular game that I like? What about Elden Ring? What about Baldur's Gate 3? Just to give an example, what about Expedition 33? What about WoW Expedition 33? And you need to realize that when I make the claim that old school gaming was better than modern gaming, it's not really that I am trying to say that 100% of the games were better, but most of the games were in fact better. That doesn't mean that there are no good modern games, but they are for sure a minority. Don't come to me with that woman logic. But what about this tiny objection, this tiny exception? What about it? That's woman logic. One of the many reasons that I am thinking why old school games were better is because of the authenticity. I think modern games are not really authentic. I think modern games are trying to just sell you a game. They are just trying to sell you a product, and they are not coming from an authentic place. They are not being authentic. When they are not really trying, there is not a group of developers that are just trying to make a good video game. They are not motivated by passion. They are just motivated by greed. In fact, most of these games are probably not even started by game developers. They are just being green-lighted by these CEOs, these managers, these directives that don't give a shit about making a good video game or making a video game in general. They just want to make more money. Another reason why maybe modern games feel less engaging or less good than old school games, it may be because we are numb. We are becoming numb. That's maybe a valid argument, because we are basically dopamine addicts, essentially. If you play video games, you're probably a dopamine addict. That's the truth. There is a possibility that the reason why you find old school gaming better is because modern games don't really hit the spot anymore. Video games aren't hitting the spot. Maybe you need more dopamine. So you have been playing video games for years. Maybe it's expected that they no longer provide that dopamine hit that they provided years ago for you. That could be another reason why you're finding old school games better. But I think that there is more to it. Like I said, authenticity I think is one of the main reasons why old school video games are better or were better than modern video games. If we compare old school games to modern games, we find out that old school games were harder. And there is a good reason why old school games were harder. The main reason was because back then you could just rent a video game, finish it in a weekend, and basically never buy the game. You never buy the game. So developers found out that this was what players were doing, and they on purpose made their games harder. Oftentimes they were just outright cheap. And while I was playing Brainlord, I detected that this game Brainlord is actually pretty cheap. There are many overly hard or complicated platforming sections or even cheap shots around the corner that feel like they are there on purpose to slow the player progress down. And I believe that is the reason, because they know players back then were just renting their video games. And that wasn't profitable, obviously, so they had to make their games harder. Now, making a game harder makes the reward of beating that game even higher. It's a greater reward compared to modern games that oftentimes are just piece easy. Oftentimes you just beat a modern video game and you don't even remember that game anymore, because it wasn't even relevant to your life. Try to think about any old school game that you have played and you probably remember the hardest sections of that video game. And guess why that is the case? It's because for your brain, for yourself, beating that hard video game was an achievement. You felt good for doing that, especially when you were a kid. Now, this is not me saying that all video games have to be hard as fucking balls. That's not what I am saying, because I personally dislike overly complicated and hard video games that are just hard for the sake of being hard. Like, for example, I fucking hate Souls-like slop garbage. And the reason why, it's not because I completely hate the genre, it's because Souls-like games have completely devolved into just being hard for the sake of being hard. And I just hate that shit. This is not what I am saying. What I am saying is that video games need to be challenging, or sufficiently challenging to engage the player and to make themselves relevant to the player's life, to make the player feel accomplished when they beat these challenges. And modern video games are really easy. Most of them are really easy. This is why I started to play most of my video games on the hardest difficulty. I have been doing that for maybe like 10 years now, maybe more. I usually pick the hardest difficulty because I know normal difficulty is just basically normie difficulty, non-gamer difficulty. I don't get any satisfaction of playing a game in normal difficulty. There are just a few games that I choose to keep them at normal difficulty. If I have the chance to pick a difficulty, I keep them at a normal difficulty. One of those games is, for example, any game made by Atlus. Any game made by Atlus, specifically any Shin Megami Tensei game, I just keep it at normal difficulty, because usually Shin Megami Tensei games like Persona, like Metaphor, or any actual mainline Shin Megami Tensei game are usually pretty cheap. In my opinion, those games are pretty cheap, and I don't like the press turn system, so those games, when you play them on a very hard difficulty, they just pigeonhole you into making a meta build, in just playing the meta, and you can't even enjoy the game anymore, because hard difficulty pushes you to play in a certain way, and I don't like that shit. So this is why certain games I choose to lower the difficulty. Another game that where I did that was Dragon Quest XI. What a piece of shit game, filled with artificial difficulty everywhere, constantly RNG, status effects that completely impair your characters. Fuck that shit, I am not here for that garbage. This is the problem with modern gaming. They don't know how to make difficulty anymore. They don't know. It's completely polar opposites. Either the game is baby mode or the game is hard as fucking balls and you hate the fucking game. This is why I also quit Where Winds Meet. I can't stand the combat of that piece of shit game. Everything else about the game I like, but the fucking combat is a fucking terrible Temu imitation of Sekiro. They don't even understand what made Sekiro great. They don't. They completely misunderstood the game. This is why I made a whole video comparing Sekiro to Where Winds Meet, just so I can show you why Where Winds Meet is a completely inferior game in terms of combat. Sekiro is the better game, just because the combat is actually good compared to Where Winds Meet. That is a game made hard for the sake of being hard. Now, many old school games were also inconvenient. For example, you couldn't save anywhere. Most of the old school games didn't allow you to save whenever you wanted. Now, that usually is not an issue, but here's the catch. Like I said before, old school games try to increase the length of the playtime because they didn't want players to completely finish a game on a single rental weekend. They didn't want the players to just rent the game for a weekend, finish it and be done with it, and never buy the game. They didn't want that. So they tried to get out of their way to inconvenience the player. Many games didn't do that for that reason. Many games did that because they actually wanted to make this inconvenience part of the difficulty, but they did it in a good way. Modern games are very convenient these days. You can save anywhere. You barely have to make an effort. In fact, if you close the game without saving, the game is probably going to auto-save for you. So this convenience, these new modern games keep being overly convenient for the player, and this keeps making modern games really easy. There is an overabundance of accessibility and convenience in modern gaming, and I think that needs to stop. Old school games also had this raw gameplay. It was very rough. It wasn't really super polished, but it worked. You need to understand, I am not saying that developers just should half-ass their mechanics, slap them all together without thinking. No. I am not saying that. What I am saying is that old school games tried to innovate. They tried to make newer things. They had a vision and they tried to implement that vision in the best way they could, but also they weren't really trying to constantly imitate other video games. There has always been inspiration. Developers always had taken inspiration from other video games, but I believe modern games is constantly essentially playing the same game over and over and over again. For example, Crimson Desert. If you think about Crimson Desert, that fucking game is just a compilation of mechanics that worked in other video games. The only thing that I can think about that is quite unique in Crimson Desert is the huge map. That's about it, because everything else is basically a copy of every other successful video game that has been released in the past 10 years. That's basically what Crimson Desert is. And on top of that, it has shitty combat, it has garbage boss design, the character progression is fucking lame, the story is basically non-existent. People praise Crimson Desert for some fucking reason, and I can see why people like Crimson Desert in some ways, but people really overstate these good aspects of this game, because the bad aspects of Crimson Desert are really the majority of the characteristics of that game. In fact, a lot of the game mechanics of Crimson Desert have no logic. They are not really well thought. There is a reason why many people complain about the controls of the game. And even after the patches, the controls still feel like fucking garbage. So I can already tell that some people are going to say that I am a hypocrite because I am calling out Crimson Desert because of its bad design, but I am telling you that old school games were good because they were rough. But there is a difference in a game being rough, in a game being very raw, where its mechanics are maybe not the best, but they work and they have a logic behind them, compared to a game that honestly just copies every fucking successful game, and on top of that they implement mechanics that don't really make a lot of sense. There is a very clear difference between those two examples. Another big reason why old school games were good is because they had their own engine. Every video game that you played back then was its own thing. It looked really different from one another, compared to modern gaming where every fucking game it's either made on the same fucking shitty Unreal Engine, Unity engine, any of those fast food engines that have their place. Those engines have their place if you're an indie developer, but if you're a AAA company, you have no fucking business using Unreal Engine, Unity. You have no fucking business doing that. Those engines are not for big companies. They are not for you motherfuckers. Those engines are to facilitate indie developers to make actual video games. Another problem is the art style. Every fucking modern video game has to be overly realistic. Even if they have their own engine, they try to be realistic. I fucking hate realistic games. I am over fucking realism in my video games. I am fucking tired of that shit. Even if you don't use Unreal Engine, even if you don't use any of these slope engines, you're trying to make your game look realistic. It looks the same to me. It actually looks the same. You may as well have used Unreal Engine because for me there is no fucking difference anymore. But these modern video game companies keep pushing fucking realism. Constantly, all their games have to have realism video game graphics. I don't understand why, but I am, like I said, I am sick and tired of video games trying to be realistic. In fact, these days I prefer pixel art than modern game garbage realistic graphics. Another aspect that has been completely downgraded is the music. Old school games had really good music. I don't understand why modern games have shitty music. If we have all this new technology, I don't understand why. Well, maybe I do understand why. And the reason why it's because everything is on a heavy fucking decline. Everything is going downhill, Western civilization is going down the drain. So of course, obviously the music is also going to be going downhill. Probably many of you remember and have good memories of video games, of old school video games. Whenever you listen to one of these old school video games music, whenever you hear a song of an old school video game, you're literally teleported back to that era where you played that game and you remember that fondly. That no longer is the case. Most of the time, video games these days have really shitty music. I think the only game that had decently good music was precisely Walkspedition 33, and Walkspedition 33 is basically an indie game. So it's not really a AAA game, supposedly. For the sake of the argument, we are going to treat Walkspedition 33 as an indie game, even though that's debatable. So other than that, I can't remember a modern game that had good music. And I am talking about mainstream AAA video games, not about indie games. There is also this ridiculous idea that video games need to become movies, and I am fucking tired of that shit. This is why I am enjoying Palworld. That's why, because in Palworld, all you need to do is sit back, relax, and enjoy a fucking video game. There is no shitty fucking story, there are no fucking cutscenes, there is nothing that is constantly interrupting your gameplay. You just are playing a fucking video game. Something that is rare these days. And it's rare because the fucking industry, the AAA gaming industry, is adamant in pushing AAA games being movie games. I am tired of that shit. People glaze Red Dead Redemption 2, and it was one of the shittiest games I have played in my entire fucking life. Red Dead Redemption 2 was boring as fuck. It was a movie game, and it was all about being a fucking movie because that game wasn't even a fucking game. Another fucking quote-unquote game that gets constantly glazed is The Last of Us, one of the first games that destroyed or made damage to the industry by the fact of being a fucking movie game. You know what games do this right? Mass Effect games. Those games do this right, because in Mass Effect, the amount of gameplay compared to the cutscenes, compared to the story, the gameplay parts are greater than the movie game parts of the Mass Effect series. So it's a trilogy of video games that try to tell you a story, but the gameplay of those games is actually there. There is actual gameplay, there is a lot of gameplay in those games. There is a ton of enjoyable moments that you're going to have playing the Mass Effect series. Even though they are heavy on the cutscene side, even though they are heavy on the movie game side, the gameplay of those games is actually really good. Another game that does that was Xenoblade Chronicles. The first Xenoblade game was another video game that was heavy on the cutscene side. You could argue it's another movie game if you want, but here is the catch. The gameplay of Xenoblade Chronicles, it's outstanding. There is a ton of stuff that you can do in that video game. There is a ton of gameplay. So having cutscenes and telling a story through these cutscenes, it's not inherently a bad thing, it's how it's implemented. And in the examples that I gave, Red Dead Redemption 2, The Last of Us, feel like they shouldn't have been fucking games. I don't know about you, but back then when I played video games, each time I booted up a new game, it felt like I was being teleported to a newer dimension. It felt like I was traveling through a new portal and entering a new dimension, because each new game was a completely fresh experience. It was very different playing one game to playing another game. For example, if you played Super Mario 3, it was a very different experience playing Super Mario 3 than playing Castlevania. It was a very different experience from playing Castlevania to playing Mortal Kombat. Each new game felt really unique. Nowadays, that's not the case. Each new game feels the same. There is no awe, there is no amusement anymore. So essentially, old school games were so unique that playing a new game back then felt radically a new experience to you, that you literally felt like you were traveling to a newer dimension. Each time you booted up a new game, it felt so different that this is why gaming in general became successful. It's because of that feeling, and that feeling has completely disappeared with modern gaming. It's completely gone. Another reason why old school games were better is because back then old school games were a niche. Nowadays, gaming has gone mainstream, and that has been bad for video games, because now the target audience is not actual gamers, it's the fucking normies, it's the non-gamers. So of course they can't make harder games, they can't make games that are challenging, they can't make games that are very unique, because they have to land these video games in a way that everyone likes them. Companies these days can't launch a game that will only satisfy a very small minority of customers. They can't afford to do that anymore, because games are so expensive these days. Games are also made to make profit, so they can't allow themselves to release these niche video games anymore. This is why the actual real successor of gaming is unironically indie games. That's the truth. Now, this is not me saying, because I have to clarify, because many of you are probably brain dead, indie games can be woke, and there are many indie games that are woke. And it's understandable because they have been feeding our culture, cultural Marxism, for decades, probably for a century now. So it's understandable that many people hate and are completely brainwashed by cultural Marxism in a way that even if they aren't really trying to push an agenda, they are going to implement those stupid ideas in their indie projects. It's understandable. So when I am saying that indie games are the real successor of gaming, this is not me blindfoldedly saying so. This is not me trying to glaze indie games completely without acknowledging that they have faults too. This is not me saying that. So don't be a fucking idiot. But you have to admit that whenever you play an indie game, you get the same feeling that you get back then. I remember when I played Vampire Survivors for the first time. That game made me feel like I was back in the 90s again. So it is fucking true. Indie games are the real successor of gaming. Modern gaming, it's no longer gaming anymore. I don't even know what the fuck that shit is, but think about it. I am not very excited for newer game releases anymore. I am not. And I am seriously considering just pivoting to just play indie games and making only reviews of indie games. Maybe I will do that, and maybe just play a few modern AAA games when I am really interested in them, which is essentially almost never these days. I can't think of any new modern AAA game that is going to be released in the future that I am excited about. Nothing comes to my mind. This is how bad AAA gaming is these days. And this is why I am really enjoying Palworld. This is why. Because Palworld is actually a game made for gamers. It's actually a fucking video game. And it's been a while since I can just sit, play a game, enjoy it for what it is, and I am not being lectured, quote unquote, because we all know that Palworld implemented body type in its character creator, but so did Elden Ring, and you motherfuckers didn't really complain about that. But also, I'm not constantly distracted by a stupid cutscene, by stupid quest markers every fucking where. This is why I like Palworld, and it's possibly my personal game of the year. I am going to make a video about that in the future. But whenever you go and watch what AAA game developers are doing, another Souls-like game, they are only chasing trends. They are only chasing what makes the most money. AAA games are not really chasing to make an authentic experience anymore. Like I said, they are only chasing what is the trend. And this is why we see constantly new Souls-like garbage, because unfortunately Souls-like games have become mainstream, super mainstream, that any new game developer wants to make their own fucking Dark Souls. I am fucking tired of that shit. Or maybe yet another survival game. Oh, but Palworld is another survival game. Yes, but it's also like Pokemon, and that's new. That's really new, and that's fresh, and it's actually well thought. It's not like they just slapped these mechanics together and they prayed for it to work. No, Palworld is actually well thought, and it works, and it's fucking fun. It's like a fucking drug, to be honest. Or yet another competitive multiplayer live service game. Another battle royale, another extraction shooter, another fucking extraction anything. This is what modern game is. They are constantly either making movie games, making shitty live service games, making new Souls-like slop garbage, and that's fucking it, basically. That's fucking it. Remember those old school fighting games? Because there are modern fighting games, we all know this, but remember the old school fighting games where you actually had to unlock characters, where you actually had to unlock a shit ton of things? Remember those old school Mortal Kombat games in the PS2 era? Remember those games where you had the crypt and there was a shit ton of unlockables where you earn different types of coins? Fuck, I remember those games because some of those games actually had some semblance of a story mode where you played in a very different way. It wasn't really a fighting game anymore. It felt like an action adventure RPG game in some sense, but you were unlocking these coins and then you would use those coins to unlock shit in the Crypt. Remember the Soul Calibur games? Remember Soul Calibur 3? Holy shit, that game was amazing. What happened to the creativity? What happened to these game developers trying to go the extra length, the extra mile, to innovate, to satisfy their customers? What happened? I am going to tell you what happened. What happened is fucking greed. All of these unlockables are no longer in the game. All of these unlockables are not tied to game mechanics, not anymore. They are tied to you buying them with your wallet. They sell you that shit. Playing fighting games this day and age is one of the shittiest experiences in gaming. What happened to fighting games is nothing short of a fucking travesty. What about Pokemon? Remember the old school Pokemon games? Remember Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal? Remember those 3 games? That was the peak of Pokemon. It felt like the game was made with passion. Developers really wanted to make that game. In fact, they wanted to make that game so badly that they gave you 2 whole fucking regions, that they gave you the whole first games all over again in one single cartridge. Developers back then went the extra mile to satisfy their customers. And you know why? Because they were passionate about it. And you are not going to find that passion anymore, especially not in modern games. You are only going to find that passion in indie games. And I can come up probably with thousands of examples of why old school gaming was much better than modern gaming, and why the real successor of gaming is actually indie games. I hope modern gaming dies. I wish the AAA gaming industry crashes completely, because it needs a complete reset. It completely needs a reset. AAA gaming can't survive anymore. Not the way it is right now. And this is why these AAA companies keep getting checks from these investors, and they keep injecting agendas into their games, because the reality is that their games are fucking garbage. A lot of them are not really selling in the numbers that they should be selling. More and more gamers are moving out to play either indie games or old school games. And it's going to keep happening. Gamers are checking out from modern gaming. And honestly, that's a good thing. Fuck modern gaming.